and Wally Stern Conference Center Seminar Room at Hudson Institute. I'm John Walters, President and CEO of Hudson. Today we are hosting a joint event with the Progressive Policy Institute to discuss one of the most critical national security issues facing the U.S. and our allies, the war in Ukraine. The question is, how can a bipartisan coalition here work to ensure that Congress does not abandon Ukraine and the U.S. fights and helps to fight for Ukraine's national survival? I want to thank Will Marshall for his help in putting together this program. I'm pleased to introduce our distinguished guests, Representative Don Bacon of Nebraska and Representative Chrissy Houlahan of Pennsylvania. Representative Bacon served the United States Air Force for 29 years, retiring as a Brigadier General in 2014. He now serves as a leading voice on the Armed Services Committee. Sanctioned by Russia for his robust commitment to defending democracy, Representative Bacon is joined by his fellow Air Force veteran and Armed Services Committee colleague, Representative Houlahan. After 16 years of active duty in the Air Force, Representative Houlahan has worked in startups, nonprofits, Teach for America, and now Pennsylvania's 6th Congressional District. She also serves on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Both are respected members of Congress who understand the threats from dictators like Vladimir Putin, and that those threats must be met with robust bipartisan action. We are also joined today by our moderators, Hudson Institute Senior Fellow Luke Coffey and Tamar Jacoby, Tamar Jacoby, who is in Kyiv and will join us virtually, who is the director of the Progressive Policy Institute's New Ukraine Project. I want to thank everybody for being here. I also want to thank our guests for their continued work on the problems that face our security, and particularly in the war in Ukraine. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Luke Coffey to begin today's program. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for coming and joining us today here in person and online. And I'm going to quickly turn it over to my colleague who's in Kyiv, Tamar, to offer some opening remarks.
Bravo.
Oh, you're not
Muted. Somebody say he's muted.
You should tell her she's not.
Tamar, you're muted.
After all these years, okay, I'm so sorry.
Hey, we've all done it.
Thank you, Luke. We'll start again. I'm unmuted, and here on behalf of the Progressive Policy Institute, the co-host of today's event. We're a democratic think tank that's been around since the late 1980s, and played a significant role then and since in formulating ideas for what were once called New Democrats, including at the time Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. And we're thrilled to be partnering with Hudson. We believe strongly in bipartisanship, and including for ourselves, not just for other people. And of course, we're thrilled to be on the podium with such a distinguished bipartisan pair of legislators. So just a word about our vision of the war in Ukraine, the perspective that we bring to the conversation today, because I'm based in Kyiv, and what I focus on most intently here is why Ukrainians are fighting and why what they're fighting for is so important to America. Because they're not just fighting to repel Russian troops, although goodness knows they're certainly doing that too, but the conflict is a full-fledged war of independence, the culmination of a 2-decade fight by an emerging democratic European nation struggling to get out from under the shadow of the Soviet Union and now Russia. And what's at stake for Ukrainians is independence and democratic governance, a market economy, membership in the West. But what's at stake for the US is not just the democratic values we hold dear, but also the strength and vibrancy and viability of that vast and right now somewhat vulnerable country on the border between Europe and an aggressive expansionist Russia. So at PPI, we believe that the US has a strategic geopolitical stake in the Ukrainian war of independence, as well as its fight to repel Russian troops. And that's why I'm in Kyiv, and that's why we're thrilled to be here today, participating in this bipartisan conversation. So with that, I'll pass the mic back to Luke, and he'll get us going.
Thank you. I want to echo everything that Tamar just said and add to it that we're coming at a crucial time in this war. it is truly a war of national survival for Ukraine. If Russia stops fighting tomorrow, the war ends. If Ukraine stops fighting, then Ukraine ends. And that is the big distinction. We always have to have that in the back of our minds, what Ukraine is actually fighting for. It's for their national survival. Of course, the 2023 counteroffensive hasn't delivered the results that many had hoped. And I think this was a combination of high expectations based off the two successful counteroffensives late last year, combined with our dithering and indecisiveness at providing the Ukrainians with the weapons that they need to actually win and not just to survive on the battlefield. So hopefully we're going back to the drawing board and thinking about how to prepare Ukraine best for next year in 2024. But as we said here today, snow is already covering much of the ground in eastern Ukraine. In other parts of southern Ukraine where the frozen temperatures haven't arrived, we're seeing a sea of mud on the battlefield. So it's coming at a very difficult time in the war. And every single day now, it seems, and I'm sure Tamar can speak to this in great detail, being in Kyiv, we're seeing this uptick in the use of Iranian drones and Russian missiles attacking civilian infrastructure. After a pause of a few weeks, we're seeing what Russia has been doing, building up their inventories to unleash them against the Ukrainian population in the winter. So it's a crucial time. It's an important time. We're having debates on Capitol Hill. We're having a discussion across America. Representative Houlahan, I would like to go to you first and get your take on how you see the situation, both your views on what's happening in Ukraine and maybe your insight on what's happening on Capitol Hill.
Those are all very complicated questions, and thanks for having me and a really good kind of some summary of why we're all here. For me, it's personal. My dad was born in Lviv 81 years ago into the middle of World War II. But it's personal to all of us because, as you kind of articulated, it's the survival of a democracy, a nascent democracy. It's the survival and safety, I think, of all of us in the region. You know, I think as Ukraine goes, so does that whole region possibly go with Putin's stated intentions of expansionism, and that's frightening. But you asked kind of what's going on Capitol Hill. You know, I think that we still resoundingly, kind of 3-1, let's say, are in support of making sure that we continue to support Ukraine in that effort. I think that the news cycle clearly has sort of moved away from what's going on in Ukraine. Unfortunately, I think it's not really top of mind for us here in Washington and for people back home. But we need to continue to talk about this, and we need to continue to advocate for it, for continued support, and for the supplemental to include support for Ukraine. And I think that in terms of what's going on the Hill, as you probably were following, Israel, the funding for Israel ended up not happening. And it largely, on the House side, it ended up not happening because of a very deliberate stand on the part of many people, particularly on my side of the aisle, saying, we need to make sure that whatever supplemental, whatever funding that we're sending to whomever we're sending it to includes support for Ukraine. And we tried, I hope successfully, to throw that over to the Senate side so that the Senate could do what we needed it to do, which is to make sure that whatever funding we send for Israel is also for Ukraine, is also, frankly, for Taiwan as well. Because these things are all super interconnected. And you know that President Xi is working hard to make sure that we continue to be as distracted and fractured as we are right now.
Well, he's certainly keeping an eye, and I think that's one of the strongest arguments we can make to policymakers and commentators and to the American public that, you know, if we want to save Taiwan, we need a victorious Ukraine. Absolutely. Representative Bacon, you mentioned well, we know you're sanctioned by Russia, and then you also said Iran. Are we going to make it a hat trick with China? Are you working on that?
You know, they hacked my email.
Okay, that's right.
FBI calls me, they go, you know what, the Chinese government hacked the Secretary of Commerce, the Secretary of State, the U.S. Ambassador to China, and your email.
Wow.
I go, that is just weird. Like,
Great.
out of 435 members of Congress, how was I so lucky? You know?
So can you give us your take, how you see things developing, both perhaps in a larger strategic picture with Ukraine, but also echoing the debates we're having here in Washington and across America?
Well, first of all, I agreed with your comments, Tamar's and Chrissy's, so I'll just say that up front. I'd like to start off with the big picture. It's in our national security interest that Ukraine remain independent. And there's no doubt Russia's waging a war. It's a crime against humanity, what they're doing. I mean, I think about 20,000 Ukrainian kids have been kidnapped. dispersed throughout Russia. They're moving in people into the Ukrainian territories they control right now to try to dilute the Ukrainian people there. The bombing, indiscriminate bombing that we see in the cities, I mean, it's all terrible. We got to keep calling that out for what it is. And as Tamar said, Ukraine was wanting to go to the West, embrace free markets, rule of law, and that would just think of how significant that would be for Europe to have Ukraine shift that direction. But for that very reason, Russia sees that as a threat, right? And I like studying history. There's been bad blood, if you will, between Ukraine and Russia for a long time. Stalin killed 4 million during the 1930s with the Holodomor. There was, even after the World War II, there was about 10 years of insurgency in a way that Ukraine was trying to break away. A lot of people don't realize the long history there. Ukraine values their independence. They see themselves as an independent individual nationality. Russia does not. So this is a fight for Ukraine's survival too. So back to the main point, I think it is in our national security interest that we help Ukraine remain independent. The way I've seen the last 2 years, we were briefed on this around November before the invasion, and I was pushing the administration, what are you doing? Are we sending Harpoon missiles there? Are we sending long-range air defense? And the answer was no, we don't want to antagonize the Russians. I think that's the wrong answer. We already know that Russia's going to invade. Then right after the invasion, I kept pushing, are we sending ATACMS, Harpoons? No. There's a lot of hand-wringing going on with the president and Sullivan, and they're typically 5 to 6 months too slow to send what is needed there. And I personally, the most important weapon we could send them right now is the long-range ATACMS capabilities, 300 kilometers. You hit a mailbox at 300 kilometers, and that would really put the Russian forces at risk. Their supply lines, their storage areas and things like that, and that's what we need to be doing. Now on our side, I'll just be candid how I see what happens. I saw a very pro-Ukraine party initially, but there's segments of our party that are so anti-Biden that when he flipped around April after the invasion, okay, we got to go all in and help Ukraine, even though he's only 6 months late. A lot of folks in our party suddenly, just because they're just programmed to want to be opposition, just sort of flipped. And then you have people like Tucker Carlson come out against it. So we're in a bit of a fight in our own party for the soul of this. But I'm a Ronald Reagan Republican. I believe in peace through strength. Reagan would have stood up to Putin like he did with the Soviets at the time. And I do think we should take Russia at its word. Putin's at its word that he wants to restore the old borders. This is not just about Ukraine. And so if we want to keep U.S. forces out of a war, help Ukraine win. Because the next step will probably involve U.S. forces and it'll be a lot worse. Let me just close on one point. I've seen different numbers out there, but you could say for roughly 10% of the defense budget, we've helped Ukraine prevail. They're not winning, but at least they've been able to stop the invasion and they've been able to restore some territory. But with our military aid, we've taken 300,000 Russian troops off the battlefield and have destroyed half their tanks. We've put a big dent into their air force as well. It has cost us 0 American lives. This is well-spent money for our national security.
Absolutely. I couldn't say it better and agree more. And the point about history is so important. I often like to point out that Kyiv was a thriving capital city of a regional power when Moscow was still a forest.
Yeah.
But we could have a whole, perhaps, week-long conference and seminar about that aspect of the war. I want to turn to my colleague Tamar to pose the first question to the panel.
By the way,
Thank you
she
so
said she was
much,
Democrat.
Luke.
I agreed with everything. It's a little scary.
Crazy. What happened?
Thank you so much, Luke. This is a question for both of you, and parallel question. You started to tell us, Congressman Bacon, about your party Can you both talk about the divisions in your party, and can you help us map your conference or caucus for us? You know, roughly what share of members, because we know there are Democrats opposed to the war too, right? Roughly what share of House members in your party is dead set against opposed aid? What share is lukewarm, and what share is strongly supported? Can you draw that? Help us draw that map for us. And then I'd also love to hear what you think are the best arguments for bringing your skeptical colleagues around.
If I could just add a fine point to that too, Tamar. For example, the issue of cluster munitions, we've started to hear for the first time vocal opposition from some on the left when these were delivered. So I think it'd be great if you both could map out kind of where the
Oh, you just stepped into a big one for me.
a cluster cluster bomb.
Yeah, because, you know, I agree with everything that Don just said about how I think the Biden administration has done a lot right and some things wrong. I think the response to the administration has been slow. I think Congress has been largely the one who's been pushing and continuing to push, and things have taken too long. Full stop. I think that the Biden administration has done a great job of bringing along the American people, or at least until quite recently. I think they've done a great job in terms of bringing along our allies and sharing intelligence in a very unique way that I think has made a huge difference. But I would say that for me, cluster munitions were the bridge too far. I am for all the other things, but I felt as though this was one of those things, being the head of the Unexploded Ordnances Caucus also, that I thought was not necessarily the next thing that we ought to send the Ukrainians. So it's a complicated caucus, right? You've got me sitting in front of you with that set of worldviews. They're one of the first people who called on making sure that they had air superiority, and they still don't have what I think it is that they need, the Ukrainians need. But I think when you think about the Democratic caucus, we're not as divided, I believe, at this point as the Republican caucus. I think probably if you looked at the numbers, it would be 3/4 to 1/4 in terms of still supportive of continued funding. I think the people who are not necessarily supportive are the people who tend to be understandably focused on making sure that that the United States is taken care of, and that the people of the United States are taken care of first, which I understand. But to Don's point, this is about the essence of our national security, and you can't be taken care of if you're being owned by somebody else. So I think that's kind of where our caucus divides.
And looking at the Democrat Party, I think you're about right. It appears to me about 3-1. A lot of people think our politics is this linear, left to right. I see it as sort of going like this.
Yeah.
So that we get teased from the right wing, so-called right wing, about the uniparty, which the real uniparty is where they connect up here, if you ask me, because they're voting the same way, but not maybe for the same reasons. Would be my take. In our party, if you look at polling, it's about 50-50, and you're going to see that roughly play out on the floor. However, I do believe. I just got polling back from our district yesterday. Crime and, actually, the border is the number one issue, then crime is the number two issue. So if we can get some kinds of deal with Schumer or Hakeem Jeffries and Joe Biden on the border, you can move a big block of Republican voters to do aid on Ukraine. But for many Republicans, and actually beyond Republicans, you hear the New York mayor right now, and this is now transcending parties on the border. I mean, we've had 10 million people in the last 2.5 years come here, and a lot of them don't have housing. Our cities are struggling with how to handle this, right? So if we can get some kind of deal with, President Biden and Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries on a border, I think.
And I believe that's there. Yeah. I mean, I'm on the record as supporting that as well.
So I think we can get it back to 3-1 too on the Republican side, with some kind of deal. I know Speaker Johnson personally. I've known him since 2016. I didn't always agree with everything that he said or done, but I know he's an honest, he's a decent person. And he's just made it clear. He says, I want to support Ukraine, but if I do it and don't push Schumer at the same time on the border, it's never going to happen. So I really think that that's the contours, at least on the Republican side. They're not necessarily linked in one bill, but we just got to get an agreement, and I think we can move both there. And I'll just back up. In our party, a lot of folks went, why are things a little bit dysfunctional on our side? Well, okay, we got 222, we got a 4 or 5 seat majority, depending on the day. We may go back down one today. So, but really, we're not one party. We have the Reagan Republican, which I think's still a majority, but then you have a more populist wing. I'll just call it the populist, and they're more isolationist. And there's actually a bit of an anti-law enforcement with this, and it's from the Tucker crowd, I would just say. You subtract that, we're not in the majority. And that's why it's been so hard to get 200 or 218 votes on anything. And I've always been of the opinion that we got to work with the Senate anyway, so why don't we work with the Democrats in the House and find a more consensus legislation, move those guys to the side. But this is playing out with Ukraine. It's that same wing that, and I said the other day, these folks are like the 1930s Republicans, and it got twisted on me. They said, "You're calling us Nazis." I go, I did not. You're isolationists. Just like they were in the 1930s. In the 1930s, they had the phrase, America first, to keep us out of Europe. Well, it's sort of the same group, the same mindset that's playing out in a section of our party. The Reagan Republicans know that we want to avoid war, but you avoid war by being strong, and you have strong alliances, just the opposite of what the other part of our party is saying. So that's how I see the contours on our side.
Fascinating. Thanks for the candid response to both of you. We often get stuck in this inside the Beltway mentality being here in Washington, and I know you both get out to your constituencies in Pennsylvania and Nebraska. I try to get out of the city any chance I get to hear what the rest of the country is saying about certain things. When you go back home and you meet with constituents, to both of you, when Ukraine is brought up, what do you hear? Like, what are the messages that your constituents talk about? And then what do you find to be the most effective ways to explain why Ukraine is important to someone in rural Nebraska or Pennsylvania?
So I would agree with Don and say that it is not necessarily in the top 4 or 5 in terms of what it is that people in my community care about. They care about education, mental health, inflation, jobs, the economy writ large, crime, the border, those kinds of things, and then national, international, relations. I think that has changed somewhat. I think that my electorate has become much more engaged politically about the global, their global place. For the first 3 or 4 years that I was in Congress, I counted the number of times people asked me about anything that wasn't, Pennsylvania or United States. It was less than 10. Now, every single time that I talk to a group of people, there's going to be something that's international coming up because of COVID, because of Ukraine, because of Israel, because of all those other kinds of things. So we're much more aware and connected than we were globally before. But Ukraine, the way that I try to articulate this, and frankly, my community is incredibly engaged and very thoughtful and very well educated and very well traveled, is to talk about national security. And it doesn't take too long to remind people about the history of the world and how we all got here, and that we're in peril of repeating history in that way. So I think that it is important to continue to talk about. One thing that I think Don and I would probably share in common is that I'd very much like people who are in positions such as we are in to not just echo what our community is saying about things, but also to lead and educate what we are learning, as part of our jobs. It's not just my job to represent, although that's the vast majority of my job. It's also to try to communicate and to lead on these issues.
Totally agree. We have to make the case, and I think for too long in our party, too many of the leaders were trying to get under the radar and avoid the debate, and I think it's hurt us. We should have got in there and debated and be counted. So I think the most important thing we need to say and be clear, and I started out this way, it's in our national security interest that Ukraine remain independent. You got to make the case, and I think we've been doing that here. I think the most beneficial or the most potent comment is to point out for about 10% of our defense budget, look what we've done to hurt an enemy or an adversary, to take 300,000 Russian troops, KIA or wounded, and to destroy half their tanks. Kaliningrad was one of the most heavily armed places on this globe. Right now, all those Russian forces are out of Kaliningrad. The British just announced that they removed all their air defenses out of Kaliningrad and put them around Ukraine. Just so it's having an impact what we're doing. Now I think we have to look at the counterpoints. Excuse me. There are one or two points that I think are relevant that we need to engage on. We have a $33 trillion debt. And so that's one of the big counterpoints. Why are we spending this money? Our fiscal house is way out of order. I think that's a valid point, and we have to deal with that. And I think voters are rightfully concerned, about that. And we do have some relevant problems in our country, like the border, that we got to tackle. So those are the 2 points that I think are valid, and we got to deal with them. But there's a lot of invalid points that I hear. A lot of folks are hearing Russia's an expert on propaganda. I mean, I've studied them since the 70s. Joined the military in the 80s as an intelligence officer. These guys are pros at sharing disinformation. They are some of the best. And you can see it in our own social media, these biolabs, which is not true, but that comes up all the time, that the Ukrainians are the Nazis of yesterday. I mean, I have to tell them, Zelensky's Jewish. He lost half his family in World War II. But we got to counter this misinformation out there. And there's tons of Russian misinformation being spread, and we got to be better at countering it and defeating it.
Absolutely. Tamar, would you like to?
Thank you, Luke. Yes. So I'm going to ask our panel to put on their forecasting hats. What could happen in the coming weeks if, I think we all hope that the Senate passes a robust package of military and humanitarian assistance, and it comes back to the House. Can you chart a path to winning in the House? I agree with you, Congressman Bacon. Senator Johnson sounds like he wants to make a deal. How do you advise him to proceed given the circumstances? And Representative Bacon, small asterisk, I work for a centrist Democratic think tank, but I'm actually a centrist Republican. We really do believe in bipartisanship.
You sounded a lot like me. I was wondering.
It's a circle.
Oh, yes.
Well, I don't think the Senate is going to be able to pass something on their own because you got to get 60 votes. So this is going to mandate making a deal between the two chambers. So I do believe that we're going to be able to get military aid out of the House pretty easily, but it's going to have to come with some agreement on the border. And I think we can get that done in December, right? When you start talking humanitarian aid, you're going to hear a lot more. Let's let EU, do the heavy lifting on the humanitarian side. America, we are darn good at we know how to build great weapons. And by the way, the weapons we're sending in there, we're sending them out of our stocks. We're replenishing our own inventories with this aid money. Is what is the reality of it. And I think too, I've asked the Speaker to sit with the Majority Leader in the Senate. Let's make a deal on Israel. Obviously, they're not going to pass the Israel aid with 100% paid for by the IRS money, but you maybe get half. This is how this place is supposed to work, and you got to sit down and negotiate and find a middle ground. And we have lost that art in Congress. Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill would beat each other up, and they'd have a scotch at night and shake hands. And we got to have more of that. Doesn't have to be scotch, but So I think this coming month, we're probably get an agreement on border, Ukraine. And by the way, I don't think we should just take what the president gives us. That's not. We have equal branches. We've lost the equality of our branches. The executive branch is totally owns the legislative branch right now. I think we should be demanding from the administration, what weapons do you want to send? Like, are you going to send long-range ATACMS? They should be on there. So we should push the administration. This isn't about just being a rubber stamp with what the administration wants. It's got to be an iterative thing here between us. I think in the end, we're going to get, I think, good lethal aid to Ukraine. We're going to get the border pointed the right direction. Israel will get funded because there's a universal support there. And by the way, Taiwan needs to have long-range air defenses, long-range anti-shipping, sea mines. We got to be doing it.
I agree almost completely with a couple of exceptions. I think that the broad contours of the president's package are accurate, which are all the things you outlined. All of those components need to exist together, I think, in a comprehensive package. I do believe it needs to include humanitarian aid. I think you'll get a lot more Democrats on board with making sure that it's balanced in that way, and I think you need Democrats. I'm not certain how it's going to go, if it's the Senate that leads. I hope that you're right, that there's some grand deal that's going on somewhere. I've never seen it happen.
Trying to push them.
Right,
Push
I've
them
never
to do
seen it
it.
happen, but my expectation is it'll come from the Senate, hopefully with a vote of 60-something, and come over to us. And here's where I worry. How do we vote on it? Because I worry for Speaker Johnson that he has choices, and one of them is a suspension again. And I think that will be a very dangerous thing for him to do. It's kind of strike 2 or 3. And the other one is going through regular order and through the rules. And I think that's possible too. I think that that's possible as well.
We're getting to the point. I never voted against a rule. When I got in, the chairman of the rules committee says, "Don, if you ever vote against the rules, I'm going to kick your ass." God, he says, you can vote your conscience on the bill, but you better always support. And that's what it's been. And all of a sudden, we have now 23 people voting against the rules. We're going to have to change how we think on this. We're going to have to act. They're forcing us, and it's what it should be, I believe, to work. And we're going to have to get Democrat votes on rules, which means now the rules has got to be, you got to allow for more amendments on the Democrats. I mean, this is, I think it's funny that these folks are playing hardball, and they're going to be a moderating influence over time through their, stubbornness.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it's just there's going to be some good history written on this at some point. I look forward to reading it.
Yeah, I bet. And another irony is that these are often the same people who criticize the swamp politics,
Yeah.
but they're the ones playing in the swamp.
And they love regular order until
It
they don't
doesn't
like
work
regular
for
order.
them. Yeah.
Now we've seen a lot of information and footage coming from this conflict about what the future of conflict is going to look like in the 21st century, or what it does look like, and how we need to think about it for the future in the context of the United States. You both served in the military. Now, I don't want to hear a military assessment. I would like to hear, what lessons have you both learned throughout this whole ordeal as lawmakers, as representatives, as politicians, going forward? So when, God forbid, there is another major geopolitical crisis like this, what could Congress perhaps have done better, or what lessons have you learned for the future?
So I'll start.
And I tried dragging that one out so you could have time to think,
Well,
think about it.
Yeah, I guess I'm not going to focus on Ukraine or even Israel. I'm going to focus on pandemic. We're better than this. We can plan better than this. We can spend better than this. We should anticipate what the threats are going to be. And there will be another pandemic of one form or another, as an example, which I believe is a national security threat. And the idea that we wouldn't be more thoughtful with how we allocate our budget to think about that threat, whether intentional or unintentional, as an example, is short-sighted of us. As lawmakers, I think we have a responsibility, again, to push back on people and say, I get that, it's a lot of money, but it's a lot more money to go through an enormous pandemic. It's a lot more money to, fight Russia with American lives. It's a lot more treasure.
Yeah.
And so I think that we just are better than this. And I hope that we do have this attenuation and moderation. I hope that we do somehow come to the middle. And I would love to have a Reagan-O'Neill kind of an environment. And maybe we'll head there. But right now, it's kind of a little bit not like that.
To her point, I'd say, have we sat down and talked with Schumer? And people are like, what?
Ooh.
Yeah, I go, I find it, that's how James Madison designed the system. That's how it works. It's a consensus building. And so I always find it's like a foreign language right now. Yeah. But to your question, first of all, and Chrissy touched on this, the intelligence when it came to Ukraine was extraordinary. And we've had failures on 9/11, and I worked in the intelligence crew field. There was other intelligence things, and they said, you cannot talk about this because it's single source. But on Russia, they put out very clearly, Putin has given the orders to invade, and we don't mind talking about it. I said, well, why is that not sensitive? They said there's so much of the information, there's not a single source. It's all over Russia that they've given the orders out to invade in February. And I just find that interesting. And we used the intelligence to as a information warfare tool, which I thought was also impressive. One of the highlights of this administration was how they utilized the intelligence to our advantage. On the other side, our industrial base is hollow. We after the Cold War, we shut down so much of our production capacity. We got to restore that. And we had a just-in-time mindset for weapons. That don't work either when you got this going on. We need stocks of good munitions, 155 millimeter shells, and I think we've used a lot of our HIMARS. They're gone. So we got to replace this stuff and have a much deeper supply. So I think that's another one of the big takeaways. I think too, I do believe in peace through strength, and I think what happened in Afghanistan hurt us, our reputation. I think Putin saw weakness. However, our response, Russia, though I think it's been tardy at times, I think it's helped us out with China and Taiwan, I believe. But we're the indispensable power for freedom. We can't do it by ourselves, so we need good alliances, but we are the indispensable power. When we look weak, it invites aggression, and I think that's another key takeaway.
It's important to remember that timeline. Just 6 months before Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine, the world saw Afghans falling off the wheels of C-17s.
I knew the pilot of that plane.
Yeah, so
He was under
horrific
investigation
scenes.
for a year, and the poor guy didn't have a choice, but that was brutal.
So there's no doubt that at that time our adversaries were testing us and our allies were questioning our resolve. And had we not supported Ukraine from the early days, I suspect we'd be having a panel today about Taiwan and China. I'm going to go back to Tamar, and then we're going to open it up to the floor for maybe one or two quick questions. Oh, you're muted, Tamar.
Tamar, you're muted.
Yeah, I can't. Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Somehow it wouldn't let me mute. Sorry, it's very noisy where I am, so I went off for a minute. I'm going to bring us back to where we started, which was Luke's comment about a definition of success. So President Biden, there are people on both sides of President Biden, both supporters of Ukraine and skeptics of support, who question the way Biden has framed the end goal. Skeptics say that he has no plan and that his open-ended commitment is really untenable in the long run. And friends of Ukraine complain that we've provided, as Luke put it, we've provided enough support for Russia to prevent Russia from winning, but not enough support to allow Ukraine to win. So I want to bring it back to both of you. What's your definition of success in Ukraine? And how do we do a better job of using that definition and that argument to rally continued support?
Well, I think it is a hard question because it feels that our U.S. ambassador to the region, it's reclaiming Crimea. If you talk to the White House right now, it's not. So I mean, I don't know if we have a good answer on that because ultimately, this is a war between Ukraine and Russia, and it's going to be what Ukraine ultimately decides there. So obviously, I want an independent Ukraine, that a country that's steering towards the West with a free market economy, rule of law, because that is a game changer for Europe. I guess I'm less hard over, is it Crimea or not? Ultimately, that's a decision between Ukraine and Russia. But in the meantime, I'm for we should be giving them the weapons they need to win. And we were so slow on the Harpoon missiles, so slow. Now we're doing short-range ATACMS. Why not give them the long-range ones? Let them have 300-kilometer range. And we should be helping out with more long-range air defense. And I think the F-16s are going to happen, or probably European F-16s with U.S. training in there. And I'm all for all that. But I don't know what's the end state goal. I get asked it all the time. I read Clausewitz. It's better to get the abridged version of the translation version. It's hard reading, but war is a battle of wills, and this is going to be a battle of Ukraine will and Russia will, and it's also U.S. will. We're seeing it. But if we can help Ukraine have the weapons they need, their will is strong because they want to survive and they want their country to be independent. We just got to give them the means to do so. I do think over time, Russia's will is going to collapse. You can't afford 300,000 casualties and keep taking those casualties like they're doing right now. We know in Afghanistan, when when they invaded Afghanistan, at some point their will broke and they pulled out. At some point, Russian leadership is going to say, this is killing our economy. We can't, how many losses is going to be too much? They're going to hit there at some point.
Speaking of the Russian economy, I think she is busy making sure that the Russian economy doesn't suffer as much as it ought to be suffering, so that Russia can continue to sustain the kinds of losses that it's experiencing. And so I worry because I think that history has shown that Russia can outlast people, because we will lose will and we will lose interest, and that concerns me. I also am concerned by the fact that we seem to be holding two sets of standards in our brain of aid or help for Israel and for Ukraine. We shouldn't have different sets of standards of what is success, and prove to us what success looks like, and those kinds of things. Those are the same in my mind. But I agree with you about what success is in Ukraine. I don't know what the boundaries or borders are, but it is what Ukraine determines it to be.
Absolutely. We have time for one question. I'm going to take the gentleman here in the front. If you could please state your name and any relevant affiliation you might have, that'd be great.
Alexei Savchenko, representative for the shadow Russian parliament called Congress of People's Deputies here in Washington, D.C. My question is the following. Last week, or maybe even this week, German newspaper Der Bild reported that current administration, by President Biden's administration and Chancellor Scholz, developed a plan to force Zelensky into negotiation by limiting supply of weapons and ammunition to Ukraine. Would you please comment this?
I have no knowledge of that.
Yeah, I don't know either that, but it would be wrong. I mean, I don't think again, I think it'd be counterproductive. We've been slow ever since the invasion and before the invasion to provide the high quality capabilities that Ukraine needs, and to weaken them is not right. There are people fighting for their lives. This is a Russian aggression. It's Russian barbarity. I mean, you see what the Hamas did to those little villages in Israel. That happened in Bucha in Ukraine too, right? It's happened. The Russians have been treacherous to the Ukrainian people, and so I wouldn't support that mindset. I mean, I don't want to discourage negotiations, but in the end, this is Russian aggression. And Ukrainians the innocent victim here.
I did say that was, we're going to have one question, but when your boss raises his hand, you immediately turn it back to the floor. So,
You're smart man.
I've learned a few things in my life. Mr. Walters.
Did you serve in the military?
I did, yes.
There you go. I knew it.
Well, again, thank you both for being here, but the reason I wanted to ask a question is because of your backgrounds, your experience, and the positions that you hold. We've talked about some of the topics here with regard to Russian aggression in Ukraine. We've talked about the threat from communist China and Taiwan and what's happening in the Middle East with Iran. I wonder whether you think on the Armed Services Committee, on the Intelligence Committee, in Congress, as well as in our government, whether we have a proper concept of the combination of threats here and how we respond to it, how we respond through our military, how we respond financially and economically, how we respond with our allies against what is a threat that sometimes episodically becomes something that keeps us busy and distracted more than effective. And I wonder whether you think we're prepared, or if we're not prepared, what we can do to get prepared, because you have to decide things and get support from the country and execute those things that are going to make a difference into whether our future is more dangerous or less dangerous.
I don't know totally how to answer that question other than to say that I'm an engineer, I'm a systems engineer. These things are all related. Everything that's happening in Israel or Ukraine or Taiwan or at our border, they're all connected. And I think it's our responsibility, getting back to communicating with our constituency, why do I serve on the Armed Services Committee and the Intel Committee when my community doesn't have a base and isn't really engaged in these kinds of things? Because it needs to be done, because I need to be here in the Capitol thinking about these issues. I need to be communicating with my constituency about why these things matter, so that the level of inflation can go down, so that people can have food on the table. And so I don't have a good answer to your question, other than that's why we're here, I hope. And I hope that our constituency understands and gives us the grace to do our jobs in this area.
And one of the most important things a president does is present a worldview and a strategy. And I'm not in sync with the president's vision right now. I mean, I am a part of it. But I think we need to have a clear view that the threats out there, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, they are interlinked. And it's not a formal alliance, but they are supporting each other. China is buying Iranian fuel at a record level, right? North Korea is sending weapons to Russia, so is Iran sending, I mean, so the problems we're facing, these four countries they're working together. And we got to realize that. And I think, obviously, the president is pretty clear-eyed on Russia. I think he's clear-eyed on North Korea. I don't think he's there with China quite, and I don't think he's there at all on Iran. I'll give you an example. So we had hard sanctions on Iran up into 2020. They were struggling economically. They were gasping for air. And by doing that, we restricted the amount of money they can give to Hamas and Hezbollah and all these other proxies out there. But immediately on day one, he lifted a lot of those sanctions, not all of them, but a lot of it. He's giving back money. That money goes right into their Hamas. And so I think we need to have a clear worldview about these four countries. They're working together. And we need to have a clear worldview about ourselves. And my view of it is we are the indispensable nation for freedom, but we can't do it by ourselves. We can't afford to counter China, Russia, Iran, North Korea by ourselves. So therefore, we got to build a strong alliance system, NATO, Japan, Australia, and hopefully get India more into our because of our democracy. To me, we need to have those kind of views at the very top, and you can't just say it once. I learned as a 5-time commander, what was important to me as a commander, I had to say it every day, repeatedly. This is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it. And I think the president's got to make his case. He's made his case, but he needs to make it a lot, right? On, in this case, Russia and Ukraine for sure. But I guess that's how I'd respond.
And if I could add one last thing, which is that I came from a military family. My dad and my grandfather served full careers in the Navy. I was in the Air Force. But my dad always said the DOD, the D stands for defense, right? To, Reagan. He was a Reagan Republican as well. He is a Reagan Republican, now a Democrat. But I guess my point is that it can't all be about defense and war and things that blow up. It also has to be about humanitarianism, our diplomacy, the ways that we move in the world, how we prevent these things from happening to begin with. Is not just about building up arsenals. It's also about taking care of people and leading by our values.
Well said. Well, Representative Houlahan and Representative Bacon, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedules to come here in a spirited and bipartisan fashion to discuss the importance of our assistance to Ukraine and why it matters. We're all grateful for the hard work both of you are doing on Capitol Hill to make this case. And Tamar, thank you for joining us from Kyiv, and I hope you stay warm and safe there right now. And I want to thank our audience, both in person and online, for joining us today. If you'd like to learn more about the great work that the Progressive Policy Institute and the Hudson Institute do, you can check out progressivepolicy.org and hudson.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.